Hi, my name is Dave Kretschmar. I'm the Director of Education for the Knicksu Land Trust, and this is Tales from the Gypsy, Part 2. Beautiful sunny day here. Let's go have a look at the Gypsy wagon. This is the second segment of Tales from the Gypsy. We're reading a story about squirrels, and this is Chapter 5, Alone. Perhaps it was because squirrels are taught to separate when they scatter, so they all took off running in different directions. Each of them felt their mother was right on their heels. The being that had been the center of their world, offering comfort, warmth, food, and protection, had suddenly turned into one of the swift death in the blink of an eye. So they ran, bounding in fast strides over the ground until all of them were beyond their home territory. Maybe once their panic had subsided, they would have found one another. But as so often happens in the high Rockies, the wonderful sunny day turned gray, then windy, then cold, and finally snowflakes began to fall. First small and slowly, then bigger and bigger, and soon a full-on snowstorm was blowing in. They probably all should have died, but they were young and getting strong, and their instincts started kicking in. 3 of them sought shelter wherever they could find it. The squirrel, who was known as Nelder, had a streak of wildness in him, and instead of stopping, he ran before the storm. He felt the wild fury at his back, and the strength in his limbs, and so he ran. It pushed him along with its ferocity and covered all evidence of his passing. He ran off and on for 2 days, a long way for a squirrel who will often spend their whole life in a square quarter mile. The area he now entered was populated by squirrels from the fox family. His mother had told him about them, how they had come from far away but were now starting to establish territory in the mountains of the west. She had said that no squirrel from the Red family was a match for them, and that they were fearsomely large. Nelder awoke from an exhausted slumber, and he was completely disoriented. His eyes took in the unfamiliar landscape, and then the memory of his flight came back to him, and he sat up with a start. Looking down on him were 2 of the biggest squirrels he had ever seen. "Don't see many from your family in these woods," one said. "Perhaps he's lost. Doesn't realize this is our territory," said the other. "There was a storm," Nelder choked out. "I don't know where I came from, or how to get back there." "Well, you can't stay here," the bigger of the 2 said. "In fact, it's time you were moving on." Nelder looked for sympathy in their faces, and seeing none, realized it was time to leave. He rose to his feet and slowly started away. "Don't come back here," one said laughingly, "or it won't go well for you." Nelder wandered aimlessly, nibbling at whatever he could find to eat. He saw a lot of evidence of squirrels in the area, and twice he glimpsed big fox squirrels at a distance. He always cowered and then scurried away quickly. The forest started to change, and he realized he was coming into a grove of cedars. He saw no squirrel sign, no scratches on branches, no midden piles, and smelled no marking patches on the trees, where squirrels rub secretions from special glands. Soon pools of water started appearing between the cedars. At first Nelder did not like it. Though squirrels can swim, and swim well, they are not overly fond of water. Trees had been falling in the little cedar swamp for generations. The result was that there were elevated bridges everywhere connecting little islands with a cedar or 2 or 3 on each. Old stumps rose out of the swamp with raised mounds of dirt around them, trillium and yellow violets growing in profusion with moss and ferns everywhere. The fear and worry that Nelder had been feeling slowly began to drain away. Sunlight dripped down through the trees and birds sang all around. He had been exploring the swamp for a couple of hours when he came to a little island with 2 towering, majestic cedars. They grew only 3 feet apart, and there was a ramp of earth that led up between them. Nelder bounded up the ramp and started to climb. 40 feet up, he came upon an abandoned woodpecker hole, and he thought to himself, "What a perfect place to build a nest." He set to work in industrious squirrel fashion, and in no time had the beginnings of a cozy little nest. He gathered some live green twigs to start with, and wove them into a rough frame. Then came moss, leaves, some inner bark of cedar. He had never built a nest before, so he gathered some from instinct, some from memory of his mother, and some things he gathered just for fun. He took a break to climb to the top of the tree, and when he broke through the canopy, he could see for miles in every direction. Snow-capped mountains greeted his eyes everywhere he looked, and a roiling, rushing river flowed by not yards away. He could see that his swamp, he was already thinking of it as his home, was only about 100 yards wide by 100 yards long. Best of all, there was no evidence of the fox family in the swamp. Next chapter, Reunion. Nelder settled into a rhythm of life. He gathered food, explored his territory, marked its boundaries, and slowly built up hidden caches of food around the swamp. There were mushrooms in abundance, and these he bit through with his teeth and wedged in sunny spots in the trees to dry out for later. One day he was up on the top of the cedar, looking around his territory, when he spied something down by the river. It looked like a piece of wood bobbing with a bright splash of red on it. His natural curiosity overcame any caution, and he bounded down the tree to investigate. Something Nelder could not explain began to grow in his heart as he ran. It was a feeling of warmth, excitement, as if something wonderful were about to happen. He flew down the trail to the river, and there, washed up on his little sand beach, was his brother Nearing. He lay half on a small raft of sticks, his legs dangling in the water, and he was unconscious. Nelder jumped on the raft and started shaking his brother, but all Nearing did was moan and shiver. All the pent-up expectation and emotion in Nelder suddenly burst out of him. He began to cry. Deep sobs broke out of him, the excitement on first seeing his brother, and the thought that he might no longer be alone, giving way to fear and worry. So deep was his agony, the weeks of being alone and afraid, trying to hold it all together, that he failed to stay vigilant and alert. He missed the soft footfalls, and it could well have been the end of both Nelder and Nearing. Thankfully, the creature that crept noiselessly up on the squirrels to spy on them did not count Squirrel as something worth eating. He sat quietly watching the two squirrels and was touched by the sincerity of their reunion. He let out a soft chitter, and Nelder leapt straight up in the air and made like he was going to bound away when he remembered his brother. He turned to face the animal, which was many times his size, and bristled out his tail and bared his teeth in what he hoped was a threatening look. "Easy there, young fella. I'm not going to hurt you." "What are you?" said Nelder. For looking at him was a beautiful, bejeweled creature. His fur glistened and shone like he was wearing a pelt made of light, and his face was open and friendly and inquisitive. He was a river otter, and his name was Splash. Nelder had never met or seen an otter before, so at first he was terrified and cautious. Bit by bit, Splash won him over with his cheerful banter and friendly smile. Splash lived not far up the river and regularly swam past the beach, where they were all now sitting. Nelders decided it was time to move his brother away from the river and to someplace warmer. He tried lifting him, but he could only manage a few tottering steps. "Let me help you," said Splash. With no trouble at all, he slung Nearing onto his back, and with Nelder steadying him, they progressed slowly towards the cedar swamp. When they got to the base of the twin cedars, they carefully lowered Nearing to the ground. Nelder thanked Splash profusely, and Splash turned to go. "Please come again," said Nelder. "You've been so kind. I don't know how I would have managed without you. I wish to repay you somehow." "Think nothing of it, my little friend," murmured Splash. "You would have done the same for me." And with a few quick bounds, Splash was out of sight, heading back to the river. There was no way to get Nearing up to the nest, so Nelder started to make a nest on the ground and tried to make his brother comfortable. He broke off the end of a fiddlehead that still had some dew on it and brushed it on his brother's lips to give him some water. Nearing moaned suddenly and then opened his eyes. His eyes were glazed and unfocused, but he managed to squeak out, "Nelder," before they shut again, and he fell back into troubled sleep. Recovery was slow, but every day he got stronger, and after a week he was able to climb up to Nelder's nest, and they both felt safer after that. Nelder brought him tasty morsels and nursed him so much that Nearing finally told him to knock it off, that he was no longer dying and that he was going to be fine. Chapter 6. Nearing's Journey. Nearing lost his head. Well, not literally, but when the brothers scattered, he fled for his life and didn't recover his senses for a long time after. He ran for hours through the forest, eventually stopping in a small glade, so far from his home that there was no hope of finding his way back. He had a miserable time. Twice he was nearly taken by the swift death. Once a coyote made a surprise pounce at him from a pile of brush, and only a quick leap to a nearby tree saved his skin. The other time he was quietly eating some seeds when a sudden chirp alarm from another squirrel sent him diving towards some bushes. A very annoyed, sharp-shinned hawk pounced just where he had been, ruffled its feathers, and took off again in the time it took Nearing to draw a single breath. The squirrel who had warned him was a red squirrel as well, and for a few days Nearing stayed with him. They actually might have ended up as friends, but one evening he went to gather some mushrooms and never returned. Nearing heard a great horned owl hoot, and that was enough to keep him in the nest for the rest of the night. In the morning, after a short warm-up blaze in the sun, Nearing continued his arduous journey. He couldn't say where he was going or even why he kept traveling. Traveling is in fact a not very squirrel-like behavior. Many squirrels in the red family rarely leave a 2 to 3 acre area in their whole lives, but travel he did, as if he was being tugged along against his will. His coat started to get worn and patchy, and he had very little fat on his body. He had crossed many streams and even a river in his journey, but now he came to a swift mountain river called the St. Joe, and it was running full. He thought it might be a bad idea to try and swim it, but just then he felt a little warning tingle on his spine. He slowly lifted his eyes, and there, not 50 yards away, on the lower branch of a tree, was a pine marten. The marten had been watching Nearing slowly get closer for a long time, and the path Nearing was on would have led him right under the tree. His heart leapt in his chest, but he didn't react outwardly. Slowly he turned back towards the river, and when he was close he dashed to the edge and flung himself in and started swimming. The current was much stronger than he had expected, but he never even looked back, because he knew death was waiting for him on shore. Squirrels are normally pretty strong swimmers. However, the last few weeks had been tough, and Nearing was about played out. A wave crashed over him, and he went under. He bobbed up again, but when a second wave pushed him down, he thought, "I'm not going to make it." In fact, under the water, he felt a sense of peace, and thought how easy it might be to just drift away. Suddenly a log brushed up against him, and sensing this was his last and best chance, he dug his claws into it and scrambled up on top. He choked up some water, and then fell unconscious, buoyed along down the current on a little raft of life. Thanks for tuning in to the second segment of Tales from the Gypsy. Coming up next, Chapter 7, The Fairy Swamp.